Okay, so um, when I thought about like, can I give a talk on Zoom with COVID? I was like, well, if I have to give a good talk, no. But if I just have to say a few things about Shinran, that's probably okay. So you're going to get a few things about Shinran. So there we go. So let's start with a bit. So this is from a text called Tanisho, and it's actually by a disciple of Shinran's, and it's kind of like, thus have I heard. So Shinran has died, and he's saying, this is what I heard the master say. These are the words of Shinran that I heard. When the thought of saying the Nembutsu erupts from deep within, having entrusted ourselves to the inconceivable power of Amida's vow which saves us, enabling us to be born in the Pure Land, we receive at that very moment the ultimate benefit of being grasped, never to be abandoned. Amida's primal vow does not discriminate between the young and old, good and evil. True entrusting alone is essential. The reason is that the vow is directed to the person burdened with the weight of karmic evil and burning with the flames of blind passion. Thus, in entrusting ourselves to the primal vow, no other form of good is necessary, for there is no good that surpasses the Nembutsu. And evil need not be feared, for there is no evil which can obstruct the working of Amida's primal vow. Now, I must say, when I first met the teachings of Shinran, and in fact, even now when I read that, I just sort of think, what a load of rubbish. I mean, honestly, how can anyone possibly take that seriously? So if you take it literally, it's kind of saying, as we heard last night, in eons past, Dharmakara did this thing and he practiced for eons and eons and eons. And then he created this Pure Land. And because of these vows that he made, I will not become a Buddha unless this is so. And all you have to do is say 10 times my name and you will be born in the Pure Land, which is the ground for awakening. And Shinran is saying, well, you don't need to practice ethics, you don't need to do meditation, you don't need to this, that, and the other thing. All you have to do is entrust to the primal vow of Amida, and you will be awakened by the power of Amida and not by your own strength and virtue. And you hear that, and for a start, it sounds a bit like trust Jesus and be saved. And second, it sounds, well, it sounds like he's taking everything that we hold most precious about the Dharma and throwing it in the dustbin. Now, I've had quite a long process with Shinran, because I would be having, on the one hand, an intellectual response, which is like, this is tosh. And then I would be having an emotional response, which is, this is amazing. And it's also describing how I experience my Dharma life. So I feel like I've been spending the last 15 years trying to live my way into, I suppose, seeing like the deeper meanings of it. And I suppose for me, I don't think what Shinran is doing is throwing out the Dharma. I think, okay, I'm going to come on to that. Right. Okay. Let's see what else I'm going to do. Yeah. Okay, COVID brain really isn't helping me here. Yeah, so for me, Shinran is drawing out themes that are strongly present for Bhante and that are in fact part of Bhante's distinctive presentation of the Dharma. And Shinran draws out these strands that are present both for Sangharakshita and also, in the Pali Canon, which is another absolute love of mine. But he sort of draws them out in a way that makes it very, very visible. So Bhante says, there are two radically different approaches to spiritual practice. One stressing self-help, do-it-yourself, self-exertion, while the other emphasizes dependence upon a power outside oneself, reliance in some cases on divine grace. These two approaches are generally held to be contradictory, even mutually exclusive. Either you depend on your own efforts, or you depend upon another power. And Buddhism is usually held to be a religion of self-help rather than self-surrender. But neither of these statements is strictly true. Whether one adopts the self-power or other power approach doesn't matter. In either case, one is confronted by the basic distinction between self and other, subject and object, so that the means adopted must also transcend subject and object. When that starts to happen, progress, insight really begins. In fact, though, it is impossible to separate the two. One may begin by adopting the approach of self-help, but it will soon become obvious that other power cannot be ignored. While if one adopts the attitude of other power, one cannot ignore self-help. If, say, in terms of Japanese Shin, one decides to rely entirely upon the vow of Amitabha, that will involve giving up reliance upon self-power. But in practice, it takes a lot of effort to give up one's own will and rely on somebody else's effort. So it turns out that self-power has to be part of one's approach. Likewise, the self-power of, say, Japanese Zen is never simply that. Take, for example, something as simple as walking along a road. True, you walk along it by your own effort, but did you build the road? You walk by the grace of the road. So I think what I'm really interested in exploring is it can sound as though Shinran throws out everything that we hold dear about the Dharma. But in fact, it's more like he's taking something that we think we know well, like, I don't know, a cup or something, and he just turns it the other way up, and you're just looking at the bottom of the cup. I think the image that I get is it's like if you look at the moon in the sky, and it's a crescent moon, it's partly there, and you've got this kind of nice crescent shape. And the brightly lit part, this beautiful shining crescent that we see in the sky, that's like the Dharma as is normally presented. This is the ideal. These are the practices. We're undertaking them to perfect ourselves. We change. And it's not that that's not true. It's like that brilliant crescent of the moon. Like that is part of what moon is. And yet that isn't all of the moon. There's the side that isn't lit and often isn't seen. It's invisible, it's in shadow. And yet to get a kind of fully rounded sense of what the moon is or what the Dharma life is, it's just as important to be able to see the part that is in shadow as well as the part that is in brilliant sunshine. So what I'm going to do now is talk a bit about the life of Shinran, and then draw out some elements both as we go through and at the end of that. So Shinran's born in 1173 in Kyoto in Japan. And his parents die at a young age, and he takes ordination in the Tendai tradition. He's 9, and he's supposed to have said this verse. You sort of think, is this likely for a 9-year-old boy? But anyway, he's supposed to have said, as he goes into the monastery to get ordained, like the cherry blossom, the heart planning on tomorrow is ephemeral indeed. What sudden storm may not arise in the middle of the night? So he's lost both his parents, and also Japan at that time was suffering a series of major epidemics. People were dying right, left and centre, famines, and political instability. And in fact, he's just at the start of a period that for the next 300 years, you basically just get a civil war intermittently through Japan. So he's got a very strong sense of this world, this mundane world, not being a place where you can find safety or take refuge. And the Tendai tradition, it's you might know, I went to Japan last year, and I went to these places, which was fantastic, actually. In a way, Tendai was like the Triratna of its time. So Saicho, who founded Tendai, I almost said Triratna then, basically it was founded on the sense of the unity of Buddhism, that all the different aspects, all the different Buddhist schools were simply ways to the same goal. And so it unites the 4 major schools at that time, which was Pure Land, Zen, esoteric or tantric Buddhism, and what was called precepts, which was more a sort of like Hinayana tradition. It's really sweet, actually. When you go to Hiei, where Shinran lived, they've got a temple to the precepts, so you can do a puja to the precepts. So there's a scholar that's written about Tendai. I was just like, it could be Triratna. He calls it the most comprehensive and diversified Buddhist tradition, a broad framework best suited to adapt to other cultures, to evolve new practices, and to universalize Buddhism. That's a bit of an aside. It's not really to do with Shinran. He does something else, but Shinran lives at Hiezan, which is the head Tendai temple on the outskirts of Kyoto, in its upper mountain. And in later life, Shinran talks about his spiritual path as him turning through the 3 vows. So this is him doing quite intense interpretation, but you could say he starts by what he calls the path of the sages. So he relates this to the 19th vow of Amitabha. And it's about following the myriad practices and various good acts. And it leads to the birth between the twin sal trees. That's obviously a reference to Shakyamuni's Parinirvana. So what this means is he just starts by practicing the Dharma, in a you know, these are the practices, this is what you do, you meditate, you practice ethics, you reflect on wisdom, this is what he does. And you could say this is what Subhuti has called the myth of self-development. So I'm totally expecting you're all familiar with the three myths. So this is, I can do it. It's the myth of Shakyamuni Buddha. Here I am, I'm not enlightened, I undertake these practices, I change myself, and slowly I become Buddha at some point in the future. So this is taking up the perspective of delusion, which is perfectly sensible because I don't know about you, but I'm deluded. So this is what Shinran takes on. And then later in his career, he starts focusing particularly on Pure Land practice and particularly on reciting the Nembutsu. Change my page. So the Nembutsu basically means recollecting the Buddha. Nen means now, Butsu, Buddha, so Buddha now. So this started as a series of visualization practices, because the thing is, there's already been 1,000 years of Pure Land tradition before you even get to Shinran. So this was mainstream, you know, all the different Buddhist schools, or the vast majority of the Buddhist schools in Japan at that time had Pure Land as some aspect of their teaching and practice. So this is like, it's a partnership. So you could say, like the first one, you know, practicing the precepts, meditating, I'm going to train my mind. That's like, I can do it. With Pure Land practice, it's like a partnership. It's your power and other power. So you do your part, you chant to Amida. Oh, I should have said, yeah, so Nembutsu, it starts out as meditation practices, essentially a whole series of sadhanas. And slowly over the centuries, the focus turns more and more on recitative Nembutsu, so just saying Namo Amida Butsu. So you chant to Amida. Amida's made these vows, so therefore you're going to go to the Pure Land at the moment of death. But it's your practice, you're doing it. So this is a bit like the model of the Samaya Sattva and the Jnana Sattva. So you do your part, you sit down, you do the sadhana, you imagine, you know, Manjagosha or Tara or Amitabha or whoever it is. And if you do that long enough and faithfully enough and intensively enough, at some point the Jnana Sattva will appear, and that'll be that. So Shinran actually equates this to the 20th vow. So he picks out this term in the 20th vow about cultivating the basis of all virtue, which by this point he does consider to be these vows of Amida and this Pure Land tradition. So he considers that the basis of all virtue. So one of the things that he did at Hiezan was what's called continuous Nembutsu practice. So there's a hall where they do this, and the hall is still there. And it's got a rupa of Amida, standing Amida in the center. And for 90 days, what you do is you circumambulate that rupa, saying the Nembutsu. And you don't go to sleep. You can rest for 15-minute periods with your arms on a shelf, but you can't lie down. You know, you can sort of nip out to go to the loo, but basically, like, that's what you're doing for 90 days. So this is really intense. Fancy that, anyone? And there's a little pillar there, actually, which says, Site of Shinran's ascetic practices in Japanese. Google Translate, marvelous. So this is what he's been trying. Now, age 29, he has a spiritual crisis. Like, this is the sort of thing he's doing. It's like he feels he cannot practice any harder. And yet he feels he is getting nowhere. So he talks about his calculating mind, hakurai. So the calculating mind is basically the mind that is always thinking, what's in it for me? How can I get what I want? I want this, I don't want that. And he just feels like his egotism, his self-will is, it just keeps popping up and popping up and popping up. I mean, it's just very interesting, this hakurai, actually. Once you start noticing it, it just pops up at every moment. Like you notice in the tea break, where as you go to get a cup of tea, it's almost like it just goes, okay, are there going to be any clean cups for me to use? Can I get at the tea bags, or are people in my way? Are there going to be coffee grounds in the sink? Because I hate coffee grounds in the sink. It's, I want this, I don't want that. I want this other thing, I don't want that. And this is just the deluded mind that just pops up relentlessly in every moment. So Shinran considers he's seeing himself as a being of karmic evil filled with blind passions, and his practice isn't touching this. So Shinran uses quite extreme language, which I quite like, but not everybody does. So a being of karmic evil. So when he's talking about karmic evil, what he means is spiritual ignorance. He's talking about like the basic not seeing things as they are. And blind passions, this is bonno, kleshas, basically. So out of our karmic evil, our spiritual ignorance, blind passions endlessly arise. So yeah, again, like tea break, like I notice, like if I want a cup of tea and someone just sort of gets in my way, I can just feel this sort of flash of absolute rage that they've just got in the way of me getting my tea. Or this sort of total greed that I want that sort of jam and not that, you know. So he's just seeing these little flashes all the time, no matter how hard he's trying to practice. So he feels like, I can't do this anymore, and he gives up. And he goes back down into Kyoto City. And there's a small temple there, which is also still there, and it's probably my favorite place in the whole of Kyoto. And it's called the Rokakudo, may not be saying that right. And it's really small. It's, you know, kind of room-sized, but anyway, it's got a veranda. And he goes there and he undertakes a retreat for 100 days. Now, what's interesting about this is he can't just give up and think, oh, well, never mind, I've tried being a monk, but never mind, I'll just, you know, go into business or have a normal life or whatever. It's like he's got a level of seeing the existential situation where that is not an option. And yet he's hit a brick wall in his spiritual practice. What can he do? There's a sort of existential desperation. So this temple is dedicated to Kannon, Japanese Avalokiteshvara. And on his something like 96th day, he goes to sleep, because at least he's allowed to sleep there. He goes to sleep and he has a vision of Kannon. And what Kannon basically tells him is it's okay for him not to be celibate. So from that, you can probably gather that he's struggling with his sexuality and needing to be celibate as a monk. He doesn't kind of go into it in great detail, but that would be the implication. And he so he gets he has this dream. Canon tells him he doesn't need to be celibate. And from this, he goes and finds a well-known teacher in Kyoto called Honen. Because Honen is known for teaching everybody in all walks of life. So Honen has disciples amongst the emperor's family, high-ranking aristocrats and politicians, but he also teaches women. He teaches untouchables, who are known as non-persons in Japan at that time. It's quite like India, actually. There was this sort of caste system where if you work with meat or lay out dead bodies, you were considered outside of society. And there were also slaves, and he teaches slaves as well. And what he teaches is just saying the Nembutsu. But in whatever position, if you're lying down, you say the Nembutsu. If you're going to work, you say the Nembutsu. If you're looking after your family, you say the Nembutsu. So this was extremely radical for the time. It was socially very, very disruptive. Because at that time, basically, like Buddhism was a pursuit for the aristocratic elite. Those were who became monks. And actually, the monasteries were, they had their own armies. They launched raids on each other's monasteries to burn them down. They dabbled in politics. So it was this whole kind of like high political factionalism and widespread corruption. And this is also what Shinran is seeing at Hiezan. And it's probably another reason why he's saying, I don't think this is what I want to do. Well, so at that point, Shinran considers that he's turned again. So he's let go of doing the Nembutsu as a practice that he has to do. So he has to do it really hard, and he has to stay awake, and he has to say it, night after night after night. And it's to do with, has he practiced hard enough? And he considers that he then turns through the 3 vows, and he ends up with the 18th vow, which says, well, if you've said my name even 10 times, and later in the larger sutra, it says, someone who has had just one thought moment of serene faith can also be born in my land. So for the rest of his life, Shinran considers himself Honen's disciple. He never thinks of himself particularly as being an innovator. He never founds his own school. His disciples do that in the centuries after his death. So he left Hiezan in 1201. And then a few years later, he gets forcibly defrocked and exiled with Honen and several of Honen's disciples. And this is because what Honen is teaching is considered so socially disruptive and also a threat to the monastic hierarchies. What does it mean if just anybody can have a spiritual path? If anyone can practice, you're completely losing the power of the monasteries, where basically if you want a ritual done for your dead relatives, you have to pay the monks do the ritual for your dead relatives. And actually there still is an element of Japanese Buddhism that's quite strongly like that. So Honen is offering a path where everyone can practice. But it's also considered ethically and morally disruptive, which in a way it is. You don't need to follow precepts. But it's another reason that makes it accessible to ordinary people, because they, perhaps they are making a living by fishing or hunting or whatever it is, and yet they're being offered a Dharma life. So basically, there's a sex scandal at the court. One of the monks gets beheaded, or maybe two, and Shinran, along with Honen, gets exiled, and they all get sent to like far-flung parts of Japan. And Shinran is given an official name that he doesn't use. He's not allowed to use his monastic name anymore, but he calls himself Gutoku, which means foolish, stubble-headed one. It's a rude term for a monk that doesn't follow his vows. He gets married. He starts a family. I think he has 5 or 6 children in the end. His wife is also a strong Nembutsu practitioner, and there's a shrine to her in her home province. And he considers himself neither monk nor lay. Does that sound familiar? So Honen says, whatever you do, recite the Nembutsu. If you can't do it as a monk, then take a wife. If you can't do it with a wife and children, then do it as a monk. So it's almost like he's saying commitment is primary, lifestyle is secondary. You start to be able to see why Shinran's on the refuge tree, don't you? So Shinran's exiled for a few years, and then the ban is lifted, but he doesn't move back to Kyoto. I mean, he doesn't want to be a monk anymore. He lives rurally. He teaches ordinary people. He, okay, now keep it short, Maitrisiddhi. You've got lots of other things to say. And he never meets Honen again. So Honen dies a few years later. So he never meets his teacher again. And in old age, Shinran does move back to Kyoto, and he leaves behind him his great work, the Kyogyo Shinsho, which is written in Chinese and is a sort of collection of all sorts of texts where he's written them out, and then he does a commentary. And he also writes verses in Japanese, lots of stuff in simple Japanese, and that's very unusual at the time. So the educated classes would be writing in classical Chinese, but he writes them so ordinary, unlettered people, which means people that can't read Chinese, are able to hear and understand the Dharma. And he dies aged 90. And among the writings that he leaves is these whole hosts of letters, which are really endearing, actually, where he's sending, because he used to live in Hitachi, which is sort of north of Tokyo. And so he started up all these sanghas that would just be meeting in people's houses, very, wide mix of classes joining them. And he's sending letters there and getting responses. Okay, where am I going next? So even though Shinran considers himself Honen's disciple, he does actually, he's got a radical rethinking of how to understand what it is to live a Dharma life. So he uses phrases like living the Nembutsu. It's like, how do you live a Dharma life? Okay, so let's see if we can unpack this. So Honen, for Honen, saying the Nembutsu is what Honen focuses on. So you just say the Nembutsu and you keep on saying it. And then at the moment of death, you keep saying it, you keep saying it. And at the moment of death, Amida will come and take you to the Pure Land. Now, that's all very well, but what if you haven't said it enough? And what if you die, but actually your mind is confused or you're in intense pain and you don't have this moment of right-mindedness at the point of death, or you don't manage to say the Nembutsu when you're dying, you might miss out. You might not go to the Pure Land. So Shinran has a rethinking of how he thinks about of the Dharma. And his big turnaround is that it does not depend on your faith or your practice. Birth in the Pure Land, which is in a way a synonym for awakening for him, it depends on other power. And because Amida Buddha has become Amida Buddha, and Dharmakara did all these practices in, countless eons ago, and created this stream of virtue and this stream of merit. And that adhisthana, that spiritual power, is what will take us to awakening. So if we think about self-power, our practice of self-power, what it does is it harnesses the power of the deluded mind. So our everyday mind, so you could say it harnesses the power of Hakurai, the calculating mind. So I want a certain outcome, so I do acts to bring about what I want. So it's exactly the same. It's like I manipulate the world to get what I want that's out there, and I'm going to do things to get what I want in here. So this can be really, really helpful, because this is actually how we function. This is just the mind that sees itself as separate. And then we meet the Dharma life. And of course, that's the mind we've got, the grasping mind. So that's the mind, that's the only mind that we've got access to that can engage with the Dharma. Oh, I got a lot out of that talk. That meditation really worked for me. That retreat gave me a lot. It's like, in terms of what we get out of the practice, is it going to give me what I want? Yeah, it's like, yeah. Or there's something I want, which is enlightenment. So I'm going to do these things, and then I'm going to get what I want, which is like positive mental states, metta, awakening. And the same with like, oh, there's something I don't want. I don't want my anxiety or my depression. Okay, I'm going to do something. I'm going to take action. Here am I, a self. I'm going to take action so that in the future I can not have those experiences that I don't want. So it presupposes self and agency. There's a self in here. There's a chooser choosing actions. And those actions are choosing the person that you then become. And it's not that this is invalid. And just to say, I've got absolutely no issue with the self-development model. I think it's totally marvelous. And it can work for a really long time. And then for some people, that myth of I can do it, I can walk the path, I can change myself gradually, I can become Buddha. For some people, this model, this myth, is self-transcending. It's like at a certain point, that way of thinking, there's a me in here, and in the future I'm going to become Buddha. That just falls over because it's obvious that that's not really how things are. This is Subhuti in revering and relying upon the Dharma. Although the idea of self is essential if one is to work with the progressive trend in the Karma Niyama, it is simply an idea, limited and ultimately limiting. We must give it up so that a new order or conditionality may take over. Progress is, in the end, progress in self-transcendence. For real progress to be possible, whether at the level of Karma Niyama or of Dharma Niyama, there must be a giving up of self to something beyond self that one serves and depends upon. So what Shinran is really doing is he is seeing through the selfing mind. But of course, actually, you can't, or you could say that what he's doing is he's seeing that he can't choose to see through the selfing mind. And Subhuti calls the second of his three myths self-surrender. But actually, have you ever tried to surrender? Is it under your conscious will? Can you just say, oh yes, I'm going to surrender to the limitless power of Amida? You absolutely can't. You can't do that. So what he's doing is seeing again and again, oh, Hakurai, here's my calculating mind, again, again, again. And he's saying, that is not where I place my faith. That is not what I rely on. You could say that, Shinran, he goes forth into the monastery. And then he sees he is still going for refuge to the mind that thinks, if I do this, I'll get that. If I do these practices, I'll get awakened. If I do this, I'll get what I want. I'll be a Buddha. And then he goes forth again, and what he goes forth from is the calculating mind, the mind that says, what's in it for me? If I do this, what will I get? And that is never the mind that can get enlightened. So Ratnaguna defines other power as motivation or volition that does not come from the self. It's not other than, opposed to the self. If it was, it would still be operating within the mistaken duality, the mistaken notion of a duality of self and other, which would mean it was mundane. One way of understanding it is that it's other than the deluded mind, which sees things in terms of self and other. So the three myths, they're ways of imagining the world. Now, we just don't realize the extent to which we imagine worlds and we imagine self. So the self-development myth, there's a me and I can change myself and I can do it and I can become Buddha. This totally depends on imagining there's a, that there is a me and that there is a world. Now, all the stories, they're kind of stories that allow for growth. So if you actually follow that, like I say, it can be self-transcending. At a certain point, it falls over. Now, a term that people are familiar with, which belongs more to the third myth, which I'm just not going to talk about, is Buddha nature. Now, Buddha nature is a term that invites us to reimagine self. So we imagine, instead of thinking, oh, here's this everyday me with like whatever we think, la la la, here I am. We reimagine what self is. So whether we imagine it as like in our essential, deepest nature, the myth of Vajrasattva, we are diamond, we are pure. Well, that's a way of imagining self that allows for opening, it allows for shift, it allows for spiritual potential to emerge. It's just a way of imagining. What Shinran does is he invites us instead to reimagine world. So you could say it's Buddha world instead of Buddha nature, which would be like more like Buddha self nature. It's Buddha world nature. So for Shinran, this is letting go of a world where you have to placate the gods or they'll do nasty things, and a world in which enlightenment has to be earned, deserved, created. Very, very strong tradition of ascetic practice in Japan, and there still is. And he's moving into reimagining world, which is compassionate. It's like, this is where you have to start going as if. You don't want to take this literally. As if. It's as if there are forces of awakening and they are moving towards us. They are calling us. And world, Amida, whatever, is inviting us to awaken, is saying, give yourself up to these forces that just want awakening to emerge in you. So Shinran redefines the term taking refuge, which is kimyo in Japanese. And so instead of like him going for refuge, him taking refuge, he says, well, actually, kimyo, it's the command of the primal vow calling to and summoning us. It's like we're being called rather than we're doing it. So you're imagining a world of benevolence. Now, for us, we don't live in Shinran's world of gods and Buddhas and unseen forces. But culturally, we live in a world where the universe is conceived of as dead. I was actually listening to Brian Cox on the radio, and he actually said, oh yeah, the people in olden days used to think that the world was alive, elements were alive. But now we know it's just dead matter. And it's like, you may do, Brian Cox. So if we imagine that we're walking around as here I am, I'm a being, I'm a spiritual being, I have spiritual potential, but actually I'm in a world made of dead matter. Bhante actually says in Living with Awareness, a world conceived of as dead is not a world in which we have any chance of awakening. He does then go on to say whether you have any chance in this world is up to you, but that's a soft development. Anyhow, so what Shinran's asking us to do is reimagine world, Buddha world. And it's also a world that Bhante invites us into. So that's the quote that I want. Bhante says, there is an element of spiritual friendship, even transcendental friendship, or friendship of the highest conceivable level within the enlightenment experience. Within the heart of reality, there is an element of communication, an element of spiritual friendship, something that found expression in the later history of Buddhist thought as that rather mysterious concept of Sambhogakaya. So what if we reimagine world where forces compassionate to us are right here, like closer? You know, how can you be separated? In a way, this is talking about Dharma niyama processes. It's like, how, as part of conditionality, how could we possibly ever be separated from sort of forces of awakening which are either latent or working within us? When we sit to do sadhana, does it feel like we're sitting in a dead world where we have to imagine something really, really hard? And if we try hard enough, perhaps the real deal will emerge? Or is it like we're sitting in a world where, okay, we can't see Tara, or we can't see Amida, or whoever it might be, but actually they're there all the time, and we're sitting in their presence all the time? Like, how would that feel if you were living in Buddha world? Like, do we take this seriously? So the shift Shinran makes is that everything is given. Our spiritual life is given. Our response to the Dharma is given. So how he thinks about it is like, we've got this calculating mind. Where am I going to go now? Sorry, COVID brain happening again. So in that passage we read first, when the thought of saying the Nembutsu erupts from deep within, having entrusted ourselves to the inconceivable power of Amida's vow which saves us, enabling us to be born in the Pure Land, we receive at that very moment the ultimate benefit of being grasped, never to be abandoned. Now in that, it's like the thought of saying the Nembutsu erupts. It's not ours. Now, if you give a talk to 30 newcomers, two of them might have a response and they might think, yes, there's something here. I need to know more. I need to take this seriously. And the other 28 will sort of scatter off and do whatever they do. And each of us at a certain point, we were that newcomer. And something in us awoke and said, yes, I want to live the Dharma life. Now for Shinran, that's not ours. That's not like my commitment, my response, my going for refuge. Like that's just a way of conceptualizing, actually. Now, what if we turned it round and said, so for Shinran, that response, that is Shinjin, that is entrusting or faith on a transcendental level. Bhante would call it perfect vision, the first step on the Noble Eightfold Path. Bhante is radical and different to the rest of the tradition in that he doesn't call that right understanding. So if you look in Theravadian sources, the first step on the Eightfold Path is you reflect on the doctrines of Buddhism. You reflect on the Four Noble Truths. For Bhante, it's vision. So he describes perfect vision. It is as though a whole new world has opened up, as though an extra dimension has been introduced. It is direct and immediate, more of the nature of a spiritual experience than an intellectual understanding. And in dependence on perfect vision or the arising of Shinjin flows the whole of the path. But that vision, how can it be ours? How can we have manufactured it or produced it or created it? From Shinran's perspective, that is given, that is Amida, that is the nature of awakening arising in us. It's granted us as a gift. Shinran talks about being granted the mind of Amida. And it's never ours. How can it be? So how would our Dharma life feel if we saw all our practices, everything that we put effort into or cultivate, everything we think of like that, well, that's purely a result. It's not depending on us, because how can it? Our responsiveness is given to us. Okay, I think I'll probably just leave it at that for today. Maybe with the question of like, well, how would it feel if our practice was granted to us? And how would it feel if we reconceptualized Buddha world as compassionate and inviting us to awakening from its power and not from our own? How would that feel? So I'll finish with a little quote from Bhante. So this is from the survey, where he says, in the sublime realms of spiritual experience, the ego sense becomes attenuated to such a fineness, transparency, and luminosity that the terms self and non-self lose their ordinary meanings, and it becomes no less difficult to speak of the spiritual life in terms of self-effort than to speak in terms of reliance on divine grace sometimes more difficult, in fact.